let's talk about the middle mile funding. What's going on?
Yeah, awesome. So we actually got granted three different routes out of the NTIA funding bucket, and really what they did is they ran a process where they were looking for basically a project that they could provide a grant for that would help solve for the digital divide. So they were giving grants that would provide incentives for carriers to build network in locations where that were underserved with connectivity. So we looked, we were granted three routes. I'll walk through each of them, but basically we looked and we said, where could we put network where it would have the biggest impact to be able to serve underserved communities? So we looked at broadband access, community income, a lot of different factors in how we chose the routes that we wanted to do. And there were three routes. One is what we call the UPR route. So it's from Umatilla to Reno. So it goes through sort of Oregon and California and Nevada, just connects a bunch of locations there. Then we got a route from Dallas to El Paso that serves a bunch of sort of rural West Texas. And then we had an existing route from Dallas to Atlanta. And what we did on that route was, typically when you're building a long haul network, you have breakouts very, very seldomly. So what we did is we took that route and we added a bunch of breakouts to be able to serve some of these underserved communities. So that the 93 million of funding that we got from NTIA is helping us be able to go and do those three routes.
And could you break it down a little bit more? Like what happens along those routes? You said you break out shorter and shorter segments, but does that end up looking like additional DWDM
Yeah.
transport equipment or routers that you put along the way?
Yeah, great question. So we're actually, because it's a middle mile, we're actually not, and part of why we think we were so successful is we're not, in these locations, we're not the incumbent ISP, if you will. So the idea with this is we wanted to provide breakouts and capacity to a high bandwidth network that we could then partner with local ISPs to be able to offer the services. So for those local ISP breakouts, we're looking at 100 gig breakouts for our waves and internet services, as well as you can have access to dark fiber if that ISP in that local market wants to actually buy that fiber themselves and light it themselves. But we think mostly they're going to be buying waves, and we're making it available at 100 gig capacity. So think of it as we'll have like an ILA breakout hut that has the optical equipment that we need to do a breakout. So I mean, what's special here is not the technology of what we're doing, but it's where we're doing it. And so we'll break that out, and we're partnering with the local ISPs to offer those services in those markets.
And so the funding enables you to bring that to different counties and towns and
That's right. That's
things of that
exactly right.
nature.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think it's is one of the, I actually think it's very good public policy. So when you look at these routes, we'd had these routes in mind for a long time, and we looked at them, we just couldn't get them to fully pencil in. If you looked at the economics of it, it was hard. It's hard to justify. When you're looking to do one of these like breakouts, like I talked about with the Dallas to Atlanta route, being able to fund those to be able to do the breakouts, there has to be enough demand in those markets. So without this NTIA funding, we were having a hard time getting that business case to pencil in. It's very similar for the southern route going from Dallas to El Paso, and the UPR route as well, where with this funding, it allows us to take what was otherwise a marginal on the bubble kind of business case and actually prove it in and be able to go and afford to be able to do these routes. So I think it's just great, public policy,
Yeah.
because you think about the benefits of serving those communities. I think it works
And
out for everybody.
to get one of these routes approved, do you already have to know who those partners are at each one of the drops that it's coming in? Is that part of the
We
application
didn't.
then?
We didn't. So in a lot of these, we did identify target partners, but it's by no means an exhaustive
Mhm.
list. And we're actually turning up. We're enabling a program right now to recruit ISP partners into it. Where not only are we helping those ISPs, access our network, but we're also helping them understand how to access other. You mentioned BEAD funding before we started talking. Other government subsidy programs that can allow them to go and get government subsidies to build that last mile ISP connectivity. So we are, and because in a local, in rural California, there might be a small municipality or something like that who might not have the wherewithal, or might not just know how to go and apply for some of these these grants and other subsidies, we're having a program that we're sort of enabling those local ISPs to help go and get that funding and navigate that process as part of this as well.
Yeah. Could you talk a little bit more about the NTIA middle mile funding program? I mean, I think there's been some, misunderstandings or misconceptions about how much money is available from a middle mile and whether it's anywhere near enough given the size of all of the other BEAD programs that are being put into
Yeah,
place.
yeah, and I there's so many of these government programs going on now. I might screw up which program is which. But I believe the NTIA funding program was the $1 billion fund of, I think the overall infrastructure funding bucket was something like 42 or 43 billion, but that included BEAD and NTIA and a couple other programs under that larger umbrella. But I think when you think about the middle mile demand, I think of from both a demand and supply standpoint. So from a demand standpoint, I think once we start activating these communities, I think there'll be a lot of demand in those specific communities, and there's already a lot of demand traversing these locations. So if you look from Dallas, we won funding to get from Dallas to El Paso, which isn't the most urban route there is, but it's on its way to Phoenix. So we see a lot of demand going from Dallas to Phoenix. This is helping to subsidize that. But when you take a step back and look at the map, and is the $1 billion enough funding? I think the answer is clearly no. If there are a couple routes that serve a lot I'm thinking of one route in particular that serves a ton that we've been looking at for years. That serves a ton of these rural locations that cost a couple $100 million to build. And so, if you really want to, close the digital divide, and not just serving those communities, but those communities on their way to somewhere, I think the bucket's gonna have to be a little bigger than the funding that was already provided, just because these infrastructure projects take hundreds of millions of dollars to build and complete.
Right. I mean, it does seem that if those numbers are correct, and that's what I've heard as well, the ratio would be 1 to 42,
Yeah,
and that's pretty thin on the one side.
yeah.
Um, so
But if you think of like again, I think. Go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, no. I was going to ask. You talked about bringing waves as the basic connectivity for those partners, but I'm wondering if it's actually a lot more than that they would need. I mean, presumably they need to aggregate their traffic at some level, and is that part of middle mile?
Yeah,
Same thing with content distribution. Is that middle mile, or do they have to haul it all the way back to Dallas or to
yeah.
Atlanta to get
Yeah,
that?
so yeah, it's a great question. So absolutely, waves will be part of it. We think most of the ISPs that we're going to be dealing with will have the ability to aggregate all of that traffic locally, and typically they will want to be buying. They will either we'll also be offering up Ethernet services as well. So if they want to do a layer one or layer two service, but we think that most likely they will be wanting to do the layer three themselves. We have looked and we have the ability to quickly launch our transit and dedicated internet access products into these markets if the ISPs want it. But our suspicion from the
Mhm.
conversations with them is that they will want to be doing a lot of that. The layer three and BGP, they will be doing a lot of that themselves. When it comes to CDN and other products, a lot of times what you're solving for is a latency window that's 20 to 30 milliseconds. So if
Mhm.
you think it takes 100 milliseconds to blink your eye,
Mhm.
so if you draw a concentric circle around how much latency tolerance is a distance of 20 to 30 milliseconds, it's actually a pretty big radius that you can hit with that type of latency. So certainly the breakouts that we're doing can be used to enable CDNs, but we think and a lot of that CDN caching could be done in these ISP networks as well. But we think that they're probably decently well served from both a performance and cost standpoint from some of the access points that already exist. So that was right now is not part of our strategy. Now, if something changes, if everybody wants to be doing like AI processing on a localized basis, that would be awesome, and we'd love to put infrastructure to work to help enable that. It's just not the use case that's active today.
Okay. Okay. How about in the middle mile requirements? Are there any mention or need for having redundancy in the networks or in the connections?
I'm sure there are, but I don't know that level of detail. That's a great question that I wish I knew the answer to, but I don't off the top of my head.
Yeah,
We can get
yeah.
that one.
Okay. All right. Yeah. I assume that there would be as well, but just kind of curious because, of course, nobody wants to build these very expensive
Yeah,
networks and find out later that there's, single points of failure.
yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So yeah, last question. What's next?
That's a good question. I think the as hard as it seemed to go and win these awards, the next step is actually going and doing the work, which is an order of magnitude harder. So the first route that we're most focused on is that the Umatilla to Reno route.
Hmm.
We're targeting to have that active in the market in a 2-year kind of horizon. So we're frantically working with regulatory bodies to get all the approvals that we need to get the routes built. In some of the other routes, we're doing all the planning and design work and getting all of the vendors that we're going to need to go and build those routes lined up. And of course, we're selling. Now that we have these routes that we're going to be doing, we want to actively be selling them to other customers and making those other customers services available to these other middle mile communities as well. So I think it's creating a good dynamic, and we're pretty excited about it.